My name is Damian Whitlock. I'm 36 years old, CEO, billionaire, a man whose life runs on strict schedules, quarterly targets, and silent boardrooms. Feelings have no place in my world. Emotions are luxuries reserved for people who can afford to fail. As I sat in the back of my black Bentley that morning, heading to New York's main airport for a deal that could shift New York's financial tides, I wasn't thinking about anything except numbers and power. Until I saw her. A woman holding a baby, standing alone under the heavy rain. And in that fleeting moment, something broke through the steel walls I'd built around my life. I didn't plan to stop. My time was calculated down to the last second. Every delay was a cost. But something about her, the way she bent her shoulders forward, soaking wet arms wrapped around that small bundle of life, cut through me like a rusted blade. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the light turned green. Horns blared behind me, but I stayed frozen, staring at her through the rain-speckled windshield. I saw her lips moving, whispering to her baby, her eyes scanning the crowds, with a desperation so raw I felt it in my bones. Memories I'd buried deep clawed their way back. Me 7 years old, standing in an alley, my coat too thin for winter, my mother clutching my shoulders to keep me warm while her own fingers turned blue. I forced the memory down. I wasn't that boy anymore. I had built empires to erase him, but she was still him. That woman, whoever she was, still lived in a world I'd sworn never to return to. I almost drove off. Almost. But then she shifted, revealing the baby's face, and something inside me snapped. I rolled down the window. Cold rain swept in, hitting my cheek like slaps. "Get in," I said. She looked up, eyes wide with fear. People don't just invite you into their cars in this city, especially not men like me. Her gaze darted to the Bentley logo on my headrest, then back to my face. Suspicion warred with exhaustion. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, holding her baby tighter. "Please," I said, my voice rough, unfamiliar to even my own ears. "I'm not asking. Get in." Slowly, she opened the door, her soaked coat dripping onto my leather seats. She smelled of rain and stale fear. Her baby whimpered softly, a sound so fragile it made my chest tighten. I closed the window and pulled away from the curb tires, spraying water onto the crowded sidewalk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the heater filled the silence as I cranked it up, watching her reflection shiver in the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" I asked. She hesitated. Her lips were cracked from cold. "Aria," she whispered. "And this is Lily." Aria, Lily. Names that didn't belong in my world of glass towers and polished boardrooms. Names that felt like warmth I didn't deserve. I focused on the road ahead, ignoring the directions to JFK flashing on the car's built-in screen. I turned the wheel, sharply exiting toward Riverside Drive. She tensed. "Where are you taking us? Somewhere dry." She didn't speak again, but I saw her eyes blur with tears she refused to let fall. Pride. Even in broken people, it burned like iron. I pulled up to my mansion 15 minutes later. The gate recognized my car, automatically sliding open with silent obedience. I parked in front of the stone steps and turned to her. "Take this," I said, pulling my house key off the ring and handing it back to her. She stared at it like it was a weapon. "Stay here until I return." Why are you doing this?" Her voice cracked, revealing the ragged edges of a life lived on concrete. I didn't answer her, because I didn't know myself. Instead, I stepped out into the rain, feeling it soak through my suit in seconds, and walked back to my car without looking back. But as I drove away, her image burned behind my eyes. That was the moment everything began to unravel, the moment the king of glass towers realized he still had a heart. And that heart had just been handed to a stranger in the rain. I didn't know where I found the strength to step out of that car. My legs trembled violently as I carried Lily up the wide stone steps, the silver key clutched in my fist so tightly its sharp edges bit deep into my palm. Rain streamed down my face in relentless sheets, mingling with tears I refused to acknowledge. Each drop felt like ice against my burning skin, like the world's last attempt to keep me out. Inside the mansion was silent. The door closed behind me with a heavy, echoing finality, sealing us away from the howling storm outside. Instantly, warmth enveloped us, a dense, luxurious heat that smelled faintly of cedarwood and lilies. My coat dripped onto the marble floor, forming a small puddle around my boots, darkening the white stone like an ink stain I couldn't scrub away. I stood there shaking, too afraid to move, afraid to touch anything, afraid that if I breathed too loudly, alarms would blare and eject me back into the freezing dark. My heart hammered in my chest so hard, I thought it might shatter my ribs. Lily whimpered softly in my arms, her tiny fingers clinging to my damp sweater like a lifeline. Her lips quivered as she tucked her head against my neck, her breath warm and uneven on my collarbone. I pressed my cheek to hers, inhaling the faint, powdery scent of her skin. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, my voice cracking on every word. "Just for tonight. We're okay." But were we? I lifted my gaze, taking in the vastness that surrounded us. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from ceilings so high I could barely see where they ended. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed gardens blooming in the darkness, places so perfect I couldn't even dream of stepping into them barefoot. The air smelled of polished mahogany, expensive wood wax, and delicate floral arrangements placed by invisible hands. Slowly, I set Lily down on a plush cream carpet. She squealed softly, her tiny palms pressing into the thick fibers, her eyes going wide with wonder. For a moment, despite the hollow terror gnawing my insides, I almost laughed. To her, a carpet was a miracle. For months, we'd slept on flattened cardboard sheets of cracked concrete, biting into our skin, damp, seeping into our bones like a curse we couldn't wash off. I walked deeper into the mansion on trembling legs. The kitchen was a masterpiece of stainless steel and marble, pristine and silent. I braced myself as I opened the fridge, expecting it to be empty, like every fridge in every shelter, just stale air and flickering light. Instead, I found rows of fresh fruit glistening in dew-glass bottles of milk, lined up with their labels facing forward, cheeses wrapped in wax paper, vegetables stacked in perfect color-coded baskets. For a moment, my vision blurred and my knees buckled. Food. Real food. Tears burned hot in my eyes as I reached out, grabbing an apple and biting into it. Crisp sweetness exploded across my tongue, so shocking in its perfection that a sob tore up my throat before I could swallow. I fed Lily pieces of banana, her delighted giggles ringing through the silent kitchen like tiny bells, sharp and clean against the gloom I carried inside me. After dinner, I wandered down a dark corridor until I found a guest room. Its bed was massive, layered in ivory silk sheets and pillows so soft they seemed unreal. I laid Lily down carefully. She blinked up at me, her lashes fluttering once, twice before her eyes drifted shut, her thumb curling against her lips. Her chest rose and fell in that slow, rhythmic pace only babies knew. I stood there for a long time, brushing damp curls away from her forehead, memorizing the shape of her breathing, the faint glow of lamplight painting her skin gold. Finally, I walked into the adjoining bathroom. The woman in the mirror startled me. Hollow cheeks, eyes bruised with sleepless nights and silent panic. hair tangled from rain and wind. But beneath the ruin, I saw it a flicker of something defiant. Something that refused to die no matter how many times life tried to snuff it out. I stripped off my soaked clothes and stepped under the steaming shower. The water burned against my frozen skin, searing away layers of dirt, dried sweat, and shame. I stood there shaking and sobbing silently as the water pounded down, washing away the streets, the alleys, the men who spat at me when I asked for help. The women who turned their eyes away, the cold concrete, the endless fear. I stayed until the water ran cold. Then I wrapped myself in a towel softer than anything I'd ever imagined owning. My legs barely carried me back to the bed. I slid under the heavy blankets, pressing my body against Lily's warmth. She sighed in her sleep, nestling closer, her fist curling into my hair, as if she knew I needed her tether more than breath. Staring up at the high plaster ceiling, I whispered into the dark. "Who are you, Damien Whitlock? Why would a man like you help someone like me?" The mansion remained silent, but his presence lingered everywhere in the cool marble underfoot, the perfection of the sheets, the faint, sharp scent clinging to the hallway air, like an unseen sentinel. A man built of stone and glass, yet he'd given me the only thing I had prayed for these past endless months, a safe place to close my eyes. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, I fell asleep without fear. In my dreams, Lily and I walked barefoot across grass that didn't cut our skin under skies painted in gold and lavender, her laughter ringing like freedom. If only for tonight we were home. I tried to focus on the spreadsheets glowing cold and clinical on my laptop screen. Stock indexes, quarterly forecasts, merger contracts, lined with ironclad clauses. Numbers had always calmed me. They obeyed when nothing else in life did. They were loyal soldiers in black and red, never questioning, never faltering. But tonight, they blurred before my eyes. Outside my penthouse windows, Manhattan pulsed with restless, feverish light. Rain had softened to a mist curling around the glittering towers like ghosts exhaling their last regrets. I loosened my tie, tossing it aside onto the Persian rug, and raked a hand through my hair. My reflection in the black glass met my gaze with silent accusation. Jaw clenched, eyes rimmed with exhaustion I hadn't earned from work. Because it wasn't tomorrow's negotiations gnawing at my sanity. It wasn't the billion-dollar acquisition or the boardroom wars that kept my chest tight with an ache I couldn't name. It was her. Arya. I saw her face again, every flicker of fear mapped in trembling lashes and parted lips. The way her shoulders curled inward, as if bracing for a blow I would never deliver. The way her arms locked around that baby Lily with a desperation that was part shield, part prayer, part final stand against a world determined to devour them both. I poured a glass of Scotch amber liquid burning down my throat in one long swallow that did nothing to drown her memory. I saw them again, as if I were still standing in that storm. Rain pelting down, blurring streetlights into gold tears. Lily's tiny fist clutching a threadbare scarf. Arya's cracked lips moving with words I would never hear. Why did I care? She was just another shadow clinging to the edges of my empire. Another flicker of misery beneath the streetlights. Another reminder of a life I'd clawed my way out of with bloodied knuckles, sleepless years, and a heart hardened into diamond. A life I swore I'd never look back on. But tonight her presence haunted every inch of my emptiness. I walked to the window, Scotch glass heavy in my hand, and stared down at the city below. Cars crawled along avenues like glowing veins. People rushed beneath umbrellas, chasing deadlines, chasing paychecks, chasing survival. I wondered where she had been before I found her. How many nights she'd slept curled around that child, her bones bruised by concrete and cold. How many days she woke with hunger gnawing at her ribs like rats in a forgotten alley, and then shame twisted sharp and unforgiving in my chest. I hadn't helped her out of compassion. Not really. I'd helped her to silence the guilt rotting in my marrow, the guilt of leaving behind every version of myself I buried, to become Damien Whitlock, CEO, billionaire, untouchable. I'd helped her, because if I didn't, then every ruthless choice I made to survive meant nothing, and that terrified me more than poverty ever could. My grip on the glass tightened until it creaked under the strain. Was that all my humanity amounted to now, a transaction to buy myself moral peace? But then I saw her again, not in the storm, in my mind's eye. Barefoot in my marble foyer, dripping rain onto stone floors worth more than her lifetime earnings. Holding Lily against her chest, staring up at chandeliers that cost more than a year of shelter beds. Her eyes wide with wonder and terror. What was she thinking right now? Was she asleep? Was she curled up with Lily on silken sheets, fighting the terror that at any moment I might stride back in and throw them out into the dark? I sank into the leather armchair by the window, elbows braced against my knees, scotch forgotten on the side table. For the first time in years, I felt small. Not because of market crashes or failed mergers, but because I realized money had built walls around me so thick I no longer knew how to open a door without it feeling like charity. I didn't want Arya's gratitude. I didn't want her to look at me with that broken relief, that flinch of obedience born from too many betrayals. I didn't even know what I wanted. I rubbed both hands over my face, dragging them down to my chin, as exhaustion carved itself into my bones. Tomorrow, I had meetings that could shift empires and realign fortunes with a single signature. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, all I could think of was a woman and her child asleep under my roof. And as I sat there staring into the endless neon night, a silent prayer pulsed through my chest, beating in time with the rain against the glass. Please let her sleep without fear, just for tonight. Just for tonight. Let her feel safe. The morning light streamed into my kitchen before I was ready to face it. It bled through the tall glass windows in fierce golden beams, spilling across ivory sheets and gleaming marble floors. I stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, staring at the distant skyline where the city woke far below my fortress. I hadn't slept. Hours passed in silence while I sat in my office, lights off, papers ignored, staring into the darkness until dawn bled into the room. Numbers and mergers and stock prices meant nothing last night. My mind refused rest, haunted by images I hadn't asked for. Her face, Arya Lane. That moment in the rain replayed in vicious loops. The way she bent over her baby-thin shoulders, trembling beneath a soaked coat hair plastered to her pale face. The way her cracked lips moved in silent prayers I would never hear. The way her eyes flinched from mine in terror and relief all at once. What was I doing? Why had I told her to get in the car? Why did I bring her here? I'd told myself it was practicality, conscience, pity. But as dawn broke, I knew the truth tasted darker, colder, more selfish. Because for the first time in years, looking at her made me feel human. The rustle of movement pulled me from my thoughts. I heard her before I saw her soft footsteps across the marble, hesitant but determined. Each step echoed in the quiet house, sounding almost too loud for someone so small. I didn't turn immediately. Instead, I watched her reflection approach in the window glass. She wore a thick robe cinched tightly at her waist, hair still damp curling around her thin face. Her bare feet gripped the marble as if afraid it might shatter beneath her. She looked so out of place in my world of cold stone and silent walls. so heartbreakingly real. When I finally turned, her eyes flicked to mine for only a second before darting to the floor. Shame burned across her cheeks, blooming down her throat, where her collarbone jutted out sharp with hunger. "Good morning," I said, my voice low and rough from hours of silence and unspoken thoughts. "Good morning," she whispered back, barely audible. Her voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion, and something else, resignation maybe, or fear. The sound tightened something deep in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I gestured towards the table. Breakfast was already laid out by the staff: scrambled eggs, golden toast, sliced fruit arranged in spirals, thick, creamy yogurt in glass bowls. Food enough for 10 people. "For you," I said, forcing my tone flat. "And the baby." She blinked as if she couldn't comprehend the words. Then her eyes filled with something sharp and bitter. Gratitude, humiliation, and silent anger twisted together. She swallowed hard before whispering, "Thank you." I turned away, unable to hold her gaze. I poured myself another cup of coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl in silent turbulence. Lifting it to my lips, I studied her over the rim. She stood frozen, one hand clutching the robe tighter around her chest, the other trembling slightly at her side. Her posture screamed vulnerability, but there was steel beneath it too. I could sense it in the stubborn lift of her chin, the way her eyes flickered towards the hallway where her baby slept. Finally, the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Did you sleep well?" She looked up, startled. For a second, something almost like laughter flashed across her eyes, but it died quickly, smothered by caution and pain. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady but quiet, controlled. I nodded once, as if checking off a line item in my mind. But inside, everything twisted, because I wanted to ask her more. I wanted to know why she was there, who she had been before the streets claimed her, what dreams she held before survival became her only prayer. But I didn't, because if I asked, I'd have to listen. And listening meant caring. Caring meant weakness, and weakness was something Damien Whitlock could never afford. I opened my mouth to tell her I would be leaving tonight, that she could stay until I returned, that I would have my assistant arrange whatever she needed for the child. But before I could speak, a sharp cry cut through the silence. "The baby. Lily." Arya flinched like she'd been struck. Panic flashed across her face, and she turned without a word, fleeing down the hallway. Her robe billowed behind her, her bare feet slapping against marble, each step echoing long after she disappeared. For a moment I stood there, listening to the cries fade into muffled sobs, listening to her broken lullaby drift back down the hallway. My chest tightened with something I refused to name. I closed my eyes, exhaling a long, heavy sigh. The sound filled the empty kitchen, louder than it should have been, louder than I allowed myself to feel. When she returned to the kitchen with the baby in her arms, I was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table, scrolling through overnight market reports on my phone. From the corner of my eye, I watched her enter. She didn't realize it, but I felt every shift in her breathing, every hesitance in her steps across the polished marble. She moved like a shadow, silent, cautious, bracing for an unseen blow. I didn't look up immediately. I sipped my black coffee, letting the bitter heat center me. Her presence felt too human in this pristine space, too loud, too real. But I couldn't stop watching her reflection in the glass. She settled the baby into the high chair my staff had placed there this morning. Of course, she froze for a moment, staring at it with a mixture of awe and pain. This house had everything, even things it never needed. Even things it would never miss if they disappeared. I studied her hands as she opened a cup of yogurt, and scooped a spoonful into the baby's mouth. They shook so badly, she almost dropped the spoon. The baby Lily squealed with hunger, small sounds that filled the silence between us like innocent music I had no right to hear. I set my phone down on the table with a quiet click. The sound made her flinch like a wounded animal. "Arya," I said. Her name felt heavy on my tongue. Dangerous, like a weapon I could wield or discard at will. She kept her gaze down, refusing to meet my eyes as if looking at me would burn her alive. "I have a proposition for you." She went completely still. Even her breathing paused. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her gaze to mine. Her eyes were wide, dark, endless pools of terror. Lily whimpered, sensing her mother's fear, her small fingers curling around Arya's robe. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together. My voice was calm, bored. The voice I used in boardrooms to dismiss men who thought they could outwit me. "I'm leaving for Singapore tonight. There's a deal that needs my signature. I'll be gone for a week." She swallowed, throat working visibly. I saw her confusion, her mind racing to connect this information to her own fate. She said nothing, but the question trembled in the air between us. I continued, each word sharp and precise. "I don't usually have anyone stay here. This house, it isn't lived in. But it would be practical for you to remain while I'm gone." Why the words slipped out so softly, it almost didn't reach me. But it did. And for a fleeting moment, her defiance shocked me. Her voice was small, but not broken. Not yet. I felt anger flicker in my chest. Anger at myself for letting her question me. Anger at her for making me feel anything. But I kept my voice measured. Because I said, letting each syllable land with deliberate finality, "I don't want to return and find out you and the child died of pneumonia in the street." The words tasted bitter even as I spoke them. Shame burned in her eyes, but something else ignited beneath it, anger. It flared only for a second, before she lowered her gaze, snuffing it out like an unwanted flame. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, wiping yogurt from Lily's chin to hide the tremble in her fingers. "You won't be," I replied simply. "My staff will arrange meals and anything else you need." Anything else. I saw the phrase wrap around her like a chain. Her shoulders hunched slightly under its invisible weight, but she forced herself to breathe. "And when you come back?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her efforts. I could hear it, the terror, the resignation, the knowledge that her life was a footnote in my day's agenda. I paused, just long enough for her to feel it, just long enough to remind her who held the power here. Then I leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze with an unblinking finality. "When I come back," I said, my voice low, quiet, lethal, "we'll decide what happens next." I saw her spirit crumble in that moment like watching frost crack under a morning sun. Her eyes flickered to Lily, focusing on the rise and fall of the baby's chest, on her small hand, gripping Arya's thumb with blind, innocent trust. "I'll leave my assistant's number," I said, standing abruptly. She flinched at the movement, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for an impact. "She will coordinate your needs." I walked past her without another word, the scent of her. Rain milk, fear clinging to the air like a ghost I couldn't banish. At the doorway, I paused. I turned back to look at her. She was staring down at her daughter, eyes glazed with silent terror. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked. She looked breakable. "Eat," I said quietly, almost gently. "You look like you might collapse." Then I left, the echo of my footsteps ringing through the marble halls behind me, as heavy as the silence I carried out with me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because for the first time in years, a decision I made felt like it might unravel everything I'd built. Because I knew deep down under every layer of power and strategy and logic that Aria Lane was no transaction. She was a reckoning. And I wasn't ready to face what that meant. The days bled together in silence. After Damien left, the mansion felt even larger, like an endless cathedral built to worship emptiness. I woke each morning to light pouring through towering windows, illuminating marble floors so polished they reflected my bare feet like a ghost trapped under glass. Lily became my only anchor. Her small voice echoed through the vast rooms, filling them with life they had never known. She toddled across rugs worth more than anything I would ever own, giggling at dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. But beneath her laughter, loneliness clawed at me. I moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to touch anything I didn't need. Even with Damien gone, his presence pressed into every surface in the precise arrangement of the crystal decanters on the sideboard, in the heavy silence of rooms that felt untouched by warmth or memory. His staff came each morning quiet and efficient, stocking the fridge with fresh fruit and small jars of baby food. They never met my eyes. I wondered what they thought of me, the stray their master had brought home from the rain. At night, I lay in the guest bed, staring up at a ceiling so high, it felt like staring into a sky without stars. Sleep never came easily. Each creak of the house sent adrenaline spiking through my veins, fear hardwired from too many nights on streets where danger waited in shadows. Sometimes I would slip out of bed and walk the hallways in the dark, Lily asleep in her crib beside the bed. My robe whispered against the cold marble as I wandered past closed doors, each leading to rooms I would never enter. On the third night, I found myself standing in front of his study. The door was ajar, warm lamplight spilling into the dark hall. I hesitated, heart thudding. Then I pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. Papers lay stacked with ruthless precision across his desk. A crystal paperweight glimmered beside his closed laptop. On the shelves behind him were books bound in dark leather, their titles embossed in gold. Some were on economics, others on war. But what caught my eye was the single photograph tucked into the corner of the bottom shelf. Dust blurred its frame. I bent down, wiping it away with trembling fingers. It was him. Younger hair, longer, no gray at his temples yet. He stood beside an older woman, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her thin mouth unsmiling. His mother, maybe. Even then, his eyes were shadowed. I set the photo back where it belonged and left the room as silently as I had entered. That night, I sat beside Lily's crib, resting my forehead against its wooden bars, listening to her steady breathing. A storm lashed at the windows, rain pounding against glass in relentless fury. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in cold, white brilliance. I closed my eyes and whispered prayers into the dark. Not for myself. I had long since given up asking for anything. But for her. For this tiny life I was responsible for. That she would never know the hunger I'd known. That she would never feel the worthlessness I carried like a brand burned into my skin. And though I hated it, a small, shameful hope flickered in my chest as thunder rolled overhead. That maybe when Damien returned, he would let us stay. Not forever. I wasn't foolish enough to dream that, but long enough to catch my breath. Long enough to remember what it felt like to be human again. Because in this cold, silent mansion surrounded by things I could never own, I felt more like a person than I had in years. And I didn't know if I could bear losing that. I returned home before dawn. The flight from Singapore was brutal. 14 hours sealed in first-class silent meals on white china cabin lights dimmed to mimic stars, endless rows of glowing data scrolling across my laptop screen. Numbers that once anchored me blurred uselessly before my eyes. None of it touched me. My mind drifted in a silence heavier than jet lag, darker than exhaustion. The driver pulled through the gates as the sky bled from indigo to pale gray. Fog clung to the manicured lawns, curling around marble statues like phantom hands reaching for something they could never grasp. My house loomed ahead, windows dark and glossy, each pane reflecting back the man I had become. When I stepped inside, the scent of cedarwood polish wrapped around me, familiar and sterile. I handed my coat to the staff without meeting their eyes, dismissing their murmured greetings with a flick of my wrist. I didn't want anyone speaking to me. I didn't want anyone seeing me. Not like this. I walked down the hall, my shoes silent on cold marble, until I reached the guest wing. The door was cracked open just enough for warm lamplight to spill into the dark corridor. My chest tightened with something painful and unwelcome. Anticipation twisted with dread. She was there. I heard her voice before I saw her. A quiet hum, low and unsteady. A lullaby, maybe, or a prayer spoken in secret. I pushed the door open soundlessly. Arya sat on the edge of the bed, her hair falling in tangled waves around her face, casting shadows across hollow cheeks. She wore one of the white robes from the guest closet, its folds too large for her thin frame, making her look even smaller, more breakable. In her lap, the child slept, thumb tucked between tiny lips, curls damp with sweat and dreams. She didn't see me at first. Her gaze was locked on the window where dawn glowed behind sheer curtains, staining her tired face in faint gold. There was something defeated in her posture. Something that burned hot under my ribs with an anger I couldn't place. At her, at myself, at a world that forced her into this. Then her eyes shifted, met mine. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us spoke. The silence roared between us, deafening in its truth. Finally, her gaze fell to the sleeping child, her shoulders curling inward. "You're back," she whispered, each word cracking like brittle glass. I stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind me. "Yes." She didn't ask about Singapore. Didn't ask how many millions I'd signed into my empire or which rival I'd devoured before boarding the return flight. She just sat there, stroking Lily's hair in slow, protective circles, her fingers trembling. I couldn't look away from her, from the bruised shadows under her eyes, from the defiance still burning quiet and fierce beneath her exhaustion. "How was she?" I asked, nodding towards the child. She was good. Her voice was quiet, careful. "She missed you." The words pierced something deep inside me, slicing through layers of carefully constructed armor. Missed me. The idea felt dangerous, foolish. I wasn't someone a child should miss. I turned away, jaw tightening so hard pain shot up into my temples. When I looked back, she was shifting Lily against her chest, preparing to stand. "I'll get our things together," she said, her voice steady, despite the fine tremor shaking her bones. "We can leave this morning." The air froze. I felt it crack around us like ice underfoot. "Leave?" I asked, my voice low, vibrating with something dark and possessive that I didn't want to name. Her hands stilled on Lily's blanket. "You said," she began, but her words faltered. She swallowed and tried again. "You said we'd decide what happens next." I studied her. The slope of her shoulders bent under invisible burdens. The flicker of hope in her eyes that she tried to kill before it could betray her. The resignation of someone who had learned never to expect mercy. "I did," I said. Silence swelled between us, thick with everything neither of us could say. Finally, I forced the words past the tightness in my throat. You don't have to go. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide, shimmering with unshed tears. For a fleeting second, I saw the girl she might have been before life carved her down to bone and scar. I don't know, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Stay. For now. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked down at Lily, brushing her lips across the child's damp forehead with trembling tenderness. When she finally spoke, her words were so quiet I almost missed them. Thank you. The gratitude in her voice scraped across my chest like a blade. I didn't deserve her thanks. I didn't deserve anything from her. I turned away, pressing a hand to the doorframe to steady myself as nausea coiled low in my gut. Because in that moment, I realized the truth pulsing hot in my veins. This wasn't kindness. This was weakness. And one day, it would destroy us both. I sat in the quiet of the guest room long after Damien left. Lily slept, curled against my chest. Her small body pressed so tightly to mine I could feel the flutter of her tiny heartbeat, steady and calm against my ribs. Her breath brushed warm across my collarbone in gentle exhalations that smelled of milk and sleep. Outside, dawn had grown into full morning. Gold light spilled through the sheer curtains, streaking across the marble floor in trembling shapes that looked almost like water rippling under sun. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Beauty that didn't belong to me. Beauty that could be taken away the moment I reached for it. Stay, he'd said. For now, 2 words. So simple. So deceptively soft. But they coiled around my neck like a silken noose. A leash woven of pity or power or something darker I dared not name. I pressed my lips to Lily's damp curls, breathing in her scent, soap milk, and that warmth that only babies carried, like they were still halfway between earth and heaven. She stirred with a small sigh, her thumb slipping from her mouth, before she tucked it back in lashes fluttering against flushed cheeks. Watching her, a fierce, almost savage ache pulsed through my chest, tightening like wire around my heart. I didn't know what Damien wanted from me. I didn't know what stay truly meant in his world of glass towers and silent black cars and eyes that never revealed anything but calculation. Maybe it was pity, a billionaire's whim to play savior for a week. Maybe it was power, an unspoken debt I could never repay. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something colder, sharper, waiting in the shadows of his mind. But I knew one thing with blinding clarity. This place, this echoing mansion, with its marble floors and silent chandeliers, was the safest Lily had ever been. My mind drifted back to the nights under freeway bridges curled around her tiny body while rats skittered over damp cardboard, to the park bench where she first burned with fever, her skin searing against mine as icy wind tore through my thin coat. To the nights I prayed to a God I no longer believed in, begging for one more day to keep her alive. Here she slept without coughing. Here she woke to warm milk and clean blankets. Here she toddled across Persian rugs, squealing with delight, as her little hands slapped polished floors that would never bruise her knees. And if I had to trade my soul to keep her here, I would. I laid her down gently on the bed, brushing damp curls from her temple, feeling the softness of her skin under my calloused fingers. She sighed again, thumb falling from her mouth lips, parting in the perfect, unguarded peace only babies knew. I stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the gardens stretched in manicured perfection, emerald lawns cut into obedient lines, marble statues glistening with dew roses, blooming in silent, arrogant abundance. A world built to be admired from a distance. A world I would never belong to. But Lily could, if I was careful. If I stayed invisible. If I gave Damien whatever he needed to justify our continued presence here. My fingers curled tight around the curtain's edge. The glass reflected my face back at me, blurred and ghostly, against the light, hollow eyes rimmed dark with exhaustion. Hair tangled around sharp cheekbones, skin marked with hunger and sleepless nights. I barely recognized myself anymore. But deep in my chest, a small ember of determination glowed, defying the cold. He might own these walls. He might own the ground beneath my feet. But he would never own my love for her. And he would never break it. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how long he would tolerate us here in his quiet kingdom of glass and steel. But as I watched Lily sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with innocent certainty, I made a silent vow. Whatever happens, whoever Damien Whitlock truly is behind those silver eyes and razor words, I would endure him